Hi, and welcome back to SmartSquare Tools. We built a small mock-up, and we're going to put together in the next few frames, the next few short videos, how you build a conventionally framed roof, a non-truss roof, conventionally framed with common rafters, king rafters, and hip rafters. And always accompanying a hip rafter are the smaller versions, which are called jack rafters. I've gone ahead and built this 4x8 mock-up. I'm going to go ahead and I've laid it out. I want to show you the basic use of SmartSquare. And then over the course of several videos that are to come, we're going to put this entire roof package together. So everything's been laid out. I'm going to mark both sides of where my rafters are going to land on the plate and where they're going to intersect with the ridge. And I go over 1.5 inches. Make my mark. 1.5 inches. Make my mark. I'll tell you what, this is the very first part. This will be my ridge. This is my plate. Let's build a roof. So I've gone ahead and I've laid out the entire mock-up of our roof system. I'm going to go ahead and give you the labeling part, the parts of a roof system. Start at the top and work our way down. This is going to be our ridge. This is going to hold the angled pieces of our rafters. Our rafters are going to come down to this 2x4. In this case, this will be considered our double top plate. I've laid it out with all of the rafters. I've laid the ridge out with all the rafters. The rafters that come directly down are going to be called common rafters. Okay? As we work way around our corner here, the ones that come off at an angle, these are a little bit more delicate. They're called a hip rafter. And any rafter that comes off of the hip is called a jack rafter. The one that comes directly off the ridge is going to be exactly the same as our common rafter, but often it's called a king rafter. Now let's do the math. So there are things you need to know, obviously, when you're building a roof. You need to know the span. So the span of this particular roof is going to cover outside to outside. In this case, our outside to outside, we've made it exactly 48 inches, 4 feet. Okay, that would be our span. Now, our run is the next word that we need to pay attention to. Our run is going to be half the distance of the span. So it goes from 4 feet down to 2 feet. Okay, but our run also has to take into account our ridge. And the thickness of this ridge is 1.5 inches. So even though our span is 4 feet and our run is technically 24 inches or 2 feet, we have to deduct half of the thickness of our ridge. Half of 1.5 is, of course, 3/4. So we've subtracted 3/4 and we've got 23.25 to the side of our king rafter. Now that we have our span, our run, the last thing we have to figure out is our rise. I wanted a steep pitch for the southwest, and so I decided on what we call a 7/12. That means that for every 12 inches of run, we're going to rise 7 inches. Now we're going to do almost a full 2 feet of run, or 24 inches of run. That would mean our rise is going to be 14 inches, 7 inch for each foot. So this is going to end up being a 7/12. This is how we're going to mark a 7/12 with any rafter square. We're going to go to our common rafter marking, going to move it to the 7, and from our pivot point down, that's the degree of angle that we will have at the top of our ridge. Okay, so my ridge is 2x6. My rafters are going to be slightly smaller. Usually the ridge is about 2 inches deeper or wider than whatever rafters are going against it. So I'm just going to use 2x4 rafters today. I've done the calculation. My span is 4 feet. My run up to my ridge is 23.25 inches. I know that I want a 7/12 pitch, so I go to my rafter calculator. I punch in my ridge, my run, my rise, 7/12, and it calculates for me the length of my rafter. So the first thing I need to do is I need to draw a 7/12 pitch on this 2x4 and make a cut. And then I'm going to take what my rafter calculator gave me. It said 26 7/8. So I'm going to put a mark down here at 26 7/8. I'm going to draw another 7/12 pitch. I know that I want my height above plate to be 2.5, so I'm going to go ahead and mark that right now. I'm going to switch it to the flat position. Only square that can do that. I'm going to hold it there, and I'm going to complete the drawing of my relatively small but accurate bird's mouth. So I've got my bird's mouth marked. I've gone ahead and highlighted it with a Sharpie. I'm going to go ahead and cut this out quick. I've done everything I can with the circular saw. I'm going to finish this with a jigsaw. And I've got a bird's mouth. Let's give it a dry run and see how it meets up with our ridge. I can still make a slight alteration. As you can see, it's not quite tight at this point, so I can take a little bit off of my pitch cut to accommodate and make it a little tighter. I'll take care of that now. So I'm modifying the ridge, or the top part of my rafter cut, which is the pitch cut, and I'm going to take about 1/4 of an inch off. Now let's take a look and see how it fits. It's tight at the bird's mouth, and it's even with the top of my ridge. I call this a good rafter. Okay, so in our roof mock-up here, I went ahead and laid everything out 16 inches on center for the simple purpose of I wanted more rafters in here. I wanted to make sure I could show you jack rafters and things like that. So I've gone ahead and cut the rough measurements of all my common rafters. I call this guy that I just cut out my pattern. I want to show you the jigblock that can only be used from SmartSquare. I'm going to cut this degree angle, which is a 7/12. I could mark every one of them 7/12 if I wanted to take the time, but I don't want to take the time. I want to do fast. I want to do fast work, so I'm going to think like a carpenter, and I'm going to use a jig. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my pattern. I'm going to set my jig tightly, and there it is. And then I can go through and I can very quickly mark all of my pitch cut ends with the same jig. I'll mark the bottom four the same way. I'll cut them, and then I'll come back and show you how I use the jig block on the bird's mouth. Hey, I wanted to show you how we use the jig block when we're marking a bird's mouth. And because I'm making such a small mock-up, I need the smallest bird's mouth I can get. And believe it or not, this bird's mouth is a little too small even for a SmartSquare. So I've gone ahead and I've drawn on a 2x6, which would be a more realistic rafter to use for something like this, the minimum bird's mouth. And this is what I came up with on a 7/12 pitch. This would have been the perfect bird's mouth if I were actually building this structure to put up in place. As you can see, this portion with the X is the bird's mouth. That's going to get cut out. This is the jig that would match that on a stack of rafters through the entire process. I could leave my jig in place. I could mark my exact same bird's mouth on every one over and over and over again accurately. But because this version is a little smaller, we're going to do it the old-fashioned way. We know we have one. We're marking it pattern. I've marked all my 7/12s with my jig block. I'm going to hold them flush on both sides. And I'm going to mark my jig block on each one and cut it out. Okay, so I've cut my rafters. I'm going to go ahead and install all of the 4 commons on this side and the king rafter on this end. So half of my rafters will be done. We adjust the bird's mouth to where it goes. And we sink the screw. Come over to our ridge. Nice and tight. Good looking bird's mouth. Come around to this side and flush my corners. Flush my side. And then finally, my king rafter. Okay, half of them are fastened down. Now I'll cut and put and assemble the last 5. Okay, we've got all of our common rafters and our 2 king rafters on each end installed. We're gonna go ahead and cut our 4 hip rafters. So according to our rafter calculator, our hip rafter is going to be 35 and 9/16. So here's how we're going to do it. This is a different part of the square that we're using at this point. We're going to go to the hip and valley part. We know that our rise is 7 inches, so we're going to go to hip and valley. We're going to take it to 7 inches, and we're going to draw our line. And then, before we move away from that, I'm just going to go to the flat position. I'm going to hold it at 1.5 inches, and I'm going to mark a second hip and valley, mark 1.5 inches away from the first one. And I'll show you why we do this one in a moment. Okay, I'm going to show you why we did 1.5 inches space between our 2 valley marks. I'm going to cut them with my saw. I need to come clean with something. In the last few years of my framing, I would have a tendency to wire back the guard just to get it out of my way, to make things faster. It's a bad habit. I'm going to say it right now. That's a bad habit. It's an unsafe habit. I apologize for every time I've depicted that. And as you can see, I've got the guard restored to my saw. So that being said, I'm going to cut the longer of the 2 marks at a 45-degree angle because I want it to fit into the corner here. So I cut the first 45, the longer of the 2 marks, and then I come from the opposite angle, which means my 45 is going to go the other direction this time. What I have now is a double beveled piece that's going to fit perfectly into this corner once I cut the bird's mouth at 35 and 9/16. Okay, my hip rafter length is 35 and 9/16 from the long point. That's this mark. I'm going to go ahead and hold my square. I'm going to hold it to my 7 hip, and I'm going to scribe right through it. Now I'm going to take my height above plate, which is 2 3/4. I'm going to subtract 3/4 of an inch. That's called a hip drop, so that your sheathing material will plane out right. So it's going to come out to about 2 1/8 inches. I'm going to mark it at 2 1/8. And at that point, turn my square flat, lay it, and I want to draw a perfect 90-degree angle from that. And this part, this will be my hip rafter bird's mouth. Okay, I've cut out my hip rafter bird's mouth, and when I put it in place, you can see It's just a little bit below at the top, and this takes into account the thickness of my hip rafter so that my sheathing material will plane out. We have a nice tight bird's mouth here. I can actually take this piece and flip it over to this side, and it fits just as perfect. This exact rafter will fit on all 4 hips. I'll go ahead and cut those out now. Okay, we have our hip rafters cut, all 4, with the dual bevel on it. They're going to fit nice and neatly up here. And as you can see, my bird's mouth is nice and tight down here. So I'm going to go ahead and attach that real quick. And you can see the other 4 are in place as well. See how that dies in perfect? We want all of our sheathing to just flow easy. Okay, the last part of the framing on our hip roof is going to be the insertion of the jack rafters. Now the jack rafters, remember this is our hip, the jack rafters continue the layout from the common part of the roof all the way out to the corner where the fascia board will be along the hip. So it's going to have a beveled edge, and it'll have a degree cut the same degree as the roof, in this case 7/12. So I'm going to hold it on layout and attach it. There's the first one. I'll go ahead and do the other 7. Okay, so I put in 2 jack rafters on the corner of each of the 4 hips for a total of 8 jack rafters. This kind of completes the framing portion. The only thing you do from this point is you might put some blocking between, some fascia board on the tails, and then of course you'd sheet it with plywood or OSB. But the structure itself is complete, and it's a complete hip roof. We utilize SmartSquare throughout. I tell you what, being able to flip the fence from side to side was a huge asset in this. Being able to do flat work, especially when marking some of these compound angles, was also a benefit. We've got a nice little roof structure here. I'll tell you what, if you have a 4-foot by 8-foot building that needs a hip roof, come pick this thing up. SmartSquareTools.com.